Welcome to VCR, a Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
And today, we're checking out our first film noir on the podcast.
That's right. And it was selected by yours truly. So
for those of you
So for those of you who sat through our last Temptation of Christ episode, Blake immediately reneged on his promise to never let me pick another movie. So I'm as curious as the rest of you are to see how this plays out.
I think you might think that I'm lower on this movie than I actually am.
Okay, well, I think you might think I'm higher on this movie than I actually am.
Ooh, I might actually.
Spicy.
We are doing The Third Man from 1949.
Mm-hmm.
It's our first movie from the 40s. It's our... we've done a couple black and white films at this point, but there's a few firsts here. Like I said, we haven't done really a film noir before. You picked a pretty classic film noir film, I think, as well.
That's right. Film noir film.
Yeah. And that being said, let's just jump into the plot summary and continue on with the primer.
Okay, great. So, The Third Man, 1949, directed by Carol Reed. Joseph Cotton stars as Holly Martins, a down-on-his-luck author of westerns. He gets off the train to Vienna at the invitation of his friend Harry Lime, who's offered him a job. Except when he arrives, he finds out that Harry is dead, and he died under presumably mysterious circumstances. So, after meeting some colorful characters and having a few choice words with the police major overseeing one section of Vienna, Holly decides, against his better judgment, to start investigating his best friend's murder, in air quotes. What unravels from there is a very unique film noir set in the backdrop of a post-war Vienna.
Yeah, and I think we should really focus on the post-war Vienna aspect of this. Like, that is, honestly, I think that's more about what this movie is about, is post-World War II. And I think if you come into this movie thinking about it in that frame of reference, like, the film opens up with a narration kind of explaining the time period that we're in. We're in Vienna, and right now the city has almost been cut into four quadrants. And so each quadrant is being policed and orders being kept by a different country. So we have the British, the Americans, the Russians, and the French. And what it says kind of in the opening narration is that, you know, each of these factions is kind of trying to do their best to kind of keep the city together. But in the center of it all, there's kind of a group of international police. There's one person from each country kind of heading this. And none of them really speak the same language. So there's this language barrier between all of them. There's this struggle to kind of keep things grounded and kind of, you know, not let crime run completely rampant, although it's definitely running rampant at this point in time.
This movie is almost the story of a place, even more so than it's a story about characters.
I think very much so, and that's kind of where I really wanted to dive into this, rather than talk about the characters and the plot. Like, I really felt like this movie was trying to tell a story of a place and a period in time. And what's really cool about that is it's essentially the period in time that they're trying to capture is the period in time in which they're filming, more or less.
Basically, yeah. This would have been right on the cusp. Or, I mean, it would have been very, like, contemporary at the time. But, like, from a more historical perspective, what's interesting is that this takes place right after World War II, but right before the Cold War. Like, right. Vienna has been blasted all to hell. There's rubble everywhere. Like, it's just... You know, it's war-torn, for lack of a better term.
And what's really fascinating about that, too, is this is essentially war-torn Vienna. Like, they shot on location. These are the real bombed-out buildings of post-World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that it puts a lot of things in perspective to be able to see a movie filmed on that location in that period of time.
And just like the attitude of the movie too. I really love that opening narration, which, as it turns out, was by Carol Reed, the director. There's a great couple sentences in the monologue where they show like all the blasted out buildings, and the narrator is just like, Vienna doesn't look any worse than a lot of European cities. Bombed about a bit. Like, it's just the sheer like nonchalance of it all, right?
Yeah, right. This movie is very interesting because there's this feeling of wrongness throughout it. And even with that opening narration, it just feels somewhat off. And that's kind of a very unique feeling that very few films are able to do well. And I can always appreciate a film that really gets me in that kind of mood.
Yeah, the narration, it's interesting because like the narrator isn't a character that we meet later on in the movie.
No.
He's never given a name, and just like, you know, so he very quickly describes what's going on in Vienna, you know, the attitude, all that stuff. And then there's almost kind of like a pause where he's like, I have it written down actually because I liked it so much. There's just kind of a pause, and there's like, oh, I was going to tell you about Holly Martins. Like, he's almost flustered, and he forgot what he was talking about.
Right. Yeah. It's so unique, and it's such a cool opening that I was really interested immediately because like it really paints this picture of this underbelly of this city, and it makes the city feel alive and feel like we're almost entering the story partway through the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just trying to pick up the pieces. And that's, again, that's kind of reflective of the time, right? Is everybody's just trying to pick up the pieces of what's happened. And that's what we're doing as the viewers right now.
It's also kind of reflective of Holly Martins as a character. Like, jumping ahead a bit, this is a very Holly is a very interesting noir protagonist in that he is almost hilariously unqualified to be just the protagonist of a film in general.
Right. And I'm also very biased in that I love that kind of a setup in a movie where the main character has no business being the main character of the film.
No, Holly's very likable, but he's like almost cartoonishly like inept at everything he does.
And
like,
naive.
Yeah, extremely naive. Like, so for some context for our listeners, like the whole deal is Holly, at the start of the movie, he's an author of like trashy pulp fiction Western novels, right?
Right.
He's basically a hack writer, essentially.
Yeah.
And he's a drunk, as we see multiple times. The whole reason he's coming to Vienna is because he's broke, and his childhood best friend Harry Lime is offering him a job. So actually, it's hauntingly similar to our future relationship, where I'm a down on my luck writer. You're living abroad as a crime lord, and you're offering me a job to do something.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Holly's like, he's a likable enough guy, and he cares about his friend and all that stuff. But like, he's like really sticking his He's really sticking his nose places it doesn't belong, and not helping out the people around him.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Like, right off the bat, he's brought in by the international police group, and this is actually the British squad of the group. And the British kind of police officer kind of explains to him, you know, your friend was murdered. We're really busy right now. We're trying to sort things out, but we can't really help you. And Holly Martins is like, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to figure this all out. And Major Calloway, the British major.
Great character, by the way.
Yeah. He's kind of exasperated with him. He's like, I can't even remember what he says. He's like, all that you'll find is death here. There's nothing for you. Like, you might as well just go home. Like, you really should be here. Like, you're completely out of your element, Donnie.
There's a great moment in that first scene where they meet where Holly's drunk and he's angry, and he's like, now you listen here, Callahan. And he's like, it's Callaway, I'm not Irish.
Yeah. And you know what? You mentioned that Holly is drunk throughout the film. The actor who plays him, and let's move into characters and people you may know here. Joseph Cotten plays Holly Martins, and he plays him so dynamically drunk throughout the film. Like, his eyes are so glassy. I don't think I've ever seen anyone portray an alcoholic better than his portrayal of Holly Martin. It's like a functioning alcoholic.
Well, I think we made this joke on other podcasts that, like, if you're ever watching a movie that was filmed like pre-1960, just assume that the lead actor was drunk.
Yeah.
Like, whatever scene, whatever shot, he was probably shit-faced.
Yeah. Well, and especially in this case, that's what the character needed too. So, I didn't read anything about Joseph Cotton being drunk throughout the film, and I don't think he was probably wasted, but maybe he had a gin and tonic before every set or something like that, or before the camera started rolling. I would not believe that. Let's talk Joseph Cotton really quickly. So normally we talk about who these people are in terms of a modern perspective, and because this movie was filmed in 1949, none of these actors are still alive. If you haven't watched a lot of older movies, you probably honestly haven't seen a lot of these actors. However, Joseph Cotton is a relatively well-known actor, and we've actually covered him before on this podcast.
Have we?
He actually played the character of William R. Simonson in Soylent Green. He was the rich man who was on the Soylent Green board, or the Soylent board, who is murdered in the opening of that film. So he's pretty central, important to that film. If you've seen the film Citizen Kane, one of the most famous films of all time, he's actually the second lead of the film. He's playing Jedediah Leyland.
Huh.
And there's a very deep connection to that film in this as well, which we're going to get to pretty shortly, actually, I think.
Oh boy, will we.
The other characters, so we already mentioned Major Calloway, the British police major. Anna Schmidt is also very relevant to the film. She's Harry's ex-girlfriend, essentially, so she has Austrian, Russian kind of heritage. I don't remember exactly what her heritage is, but I think it was more Soviet than it was Austrian.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and so she was completely head over heels in love with Harry Lime, and so she's kind of helping Holly Martin's kind of figure out how or why Harry was murdered, because she cares so deeply for him, and part of this film is about not only her relationship to Harry Lime, but her relationship to Holly Martin's, and how each of their relationships developed and develops throughout this film. And that's a really interesting piece of this film that I really loved, because this film has a really, really good ending to it, in my opinion.
It really does. It definitely does.
And so we've talked a lot about Harry Lime. He's the friend who was murdered. We don't really know who or why or anything like that. He is played by Orson Welles, which is probably one of the most known names of this era in Hollywood.
Or any era, for that matter.
Yeah, he's one of the most famous Hollywood people of all time. Very much one of the most important or famous directors of all time. He directed, co-wrote, and starred in Citizen Kane. He was also, where I actually knew him from, was him adapting The War of the Worlds and then narrating it over the radio, and causing somewhat of a panic with people thinking that the world was actually being invaded by aliens.
That actually happened, people. Like, if you ever start feeling like humans have got their shit together, just remember that happened.
That story always really fascinated me as a kid, partially because aliens, but just this mass hysteria kind of idea. Just human beings are wild.
Oh, yeah. No. And speaking of wild, like, I guess Orson Welles, I didn't look into it too deeply, but I guess he was a pretty problematic actor on set
Yes,
for
he
this
was.
movie.
Yes, he was.
I think the joke I heard is that he was almost too in character for this whole movie.
I don't want to talk too much about the character of Harry Lime, because this is really what the film is all about, and what we're interested in learning about. What's really interesting about this film is it's kind of a mystery, but it's almost more about the why than it is about the whodunit kind of thing. The why was it done, rather than the who did it.
So, again, for our listeners who haven't seen it yet, the whole deal is, when Holly first shows up, he hears that Lime was killed in a car accident.
Hmm.
Like he just got hit by a car crossing the road, essentially. Like just kind of a random collision, whatever.
Yeah.
But Holly suspects foul play and he starts digging around, asking people, etc., etc. And gradually he learns. He starts picking out like the inconsistencies in people's stories. I have to give Holly credit. Like he's not a particularly bright guy, but he is good at pulling on threads.
Yeah.
Like the hotel porter says that he was killed on impact. Someone else says that he was struck but then conscious enough to pass on some instructions and then he died.
Right.
And then he hears that there was two people there, and then as the title comes in, he hears that there was a third man present,
Yes.
etc., etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this film, and like I said, the film is centered around the third man, but in my opinion, it's more about the why than it is about the who. And it's I knew pretty quickly where the film was going in terms of the who, but the why really interested me. I do want to mention the writer of the film. So it's written by Graham Greene. He actually wrote a novella of the film first in order to kind of work out the details of the movie and what he wanted to portray on screen. So he was really focused on developing the atmosphere of Vienna at this time period and the characterization and mood of the film. And I thought that translated really well, and I thought that was a really interesting approach to writing a screenplay.
That is interesting. Yeah.
You don't see that very often, and he never actually intended for that novella to be read, but obviously with the success of this film, they ended up releasing the novella later on.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is also directed by Carol Reed, who's most known for the film Oliver, which is a very, very famous film. You know, the poor British boy. You know what I'm talking about. Oliver Twist.
Please, sir, may I have some more?
Exactly. Oliver Twist.
Nice.
And let's talk who this movie is for. And I think where I want to start this is a black and white film from 1949. And we're immediately going to lose a lot of people here in that explanation, right?
Yeah, a lot of dumb people.
Well, and this is where I want to ask you, like, maybe give us some background into black and white film and film noir and some of the history behind that. Because I know you were kind of interested in that going into this episode.
Yeah, I've always kind of been partial. When I first went to film school, like 11 years ago, I think the first class that I really got into was my film noir class. And that's when I really started, like, you know, pulling on threads, picking things apart, that sort of thing. So I did a little bit of research today just to brush up on my knowledge, and it's interesting in the sense that, like, film noir, like, okay, maybe this isn't fair because it's you, but, like, when I just say the term film noir, like, what do you think of? Like,
I think of, like, obviously a black and white film. I think of a detective kind of thriller. I think of a film that doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. There might be a bitterness to the end of the film. A very stylistic kind of film that really uses lighting and atmosphere to essentially as another character of the film.
And I think you're touching on it really well. Like, when I say film noir, we all kind of get, like, a vibe, right? Like, we sort of get, like, an aesthetic down, but, like, even to this day, critics can't really decide whether or not it's a genre or whether it's a visual style, all that stuff. So before I jump into the origins, I actually found something really interesting. In 1995, Roger Ebert published an article called A Guide to Film Noir.
Oh, cool.
Where he just outlines the 10 qualities that every film noir has. So I went through that today, and I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to read a couple that I found the most interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
One is a movie which at no time misleads you into thinking there is going to be a happy ending.
Yes.
Another one is cigarettes. Everybody in the film, everybody in film noir is always smoking, as if to say, on top of everything else, I've been assigned to smoke 3 packs a day.
And you know what? And that's actually the first thing that comes to mind is some grizzled detective in his back office with the door closed and the blinds down and
And
him
the
sitting
fan
there
going
smoking.
and like
Yeah, the
the
fan going,
ashtray.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's the exact picture in my mind that I have when you say film noir.
Okay, another one is women who would just as soon kill you as love you, and vice
Ooh,
versa.
I love it. The Black Widow kind of character.
Another one is relationships in which love is only the final flop card in the poker game of death.
I love it. I love this. So descriptive.
Okay, and the one, just one more, and this one's my favorite. The most American film genre, because no society could have created a world so filled with doom, fate, fear, and betrayal unless it were essentially naive and optimistic.
You know what? You just summed up this movie to a T.
Pretty much, yeah. So,
I love
again,
it.
just touching on the origins a little more. I guess what the other thing that's kind of interesting about film noir is that it's sort of metastasized, like the genre conventions sort of like metastasize in like the mid to early 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And they just started churning these movies out. They were relatively low budget. At the time, they were more considered like melodramas. But then, if I remember correctly from film school, what's interesting is that during World War II, like European critics couldn't get their hands on American films.
Uh-huh.
So after the war, they started getting this backlog of all these American films from the last 5 to 10 years. And they were instantly like, whoa, what's going on in America right now? So like actually film noir, it's a French term that literally means black film or dark film.
Yes.
And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that within like 5 years, people started playing with conventions. Like,
right.
Like if you want to think about this in terms of like an evil AI, like film noir became self-aware pretty quickly, and it started acting funny essentially.
Cool.
And then again, just one more note about origins is it partly was influenced by German expressionism from the 1920s and 30s. Mm-hmm. So these were like German filmmakers who had like very distinct lighting styles, very distinct narratives, a lot of that stuff. And then a lot of them fled the Nazis in the 30s and came to Hollywood and brought their techniques with them. And again, like kind of what you mentioned earlier, the other big origin point is crime fiction from the 30s and 40s. Right. So like writers like Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. I remember I had a professor back in the day who basically said like those stories were translated to the screen really well because it was essentially just like talking and fighting.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, like the old school gangster movies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to say, because we're touching on the genre a bit, and I want to touch on the black and white aspect of the film as well. This is something that I'm really just kind of starting to delve into myself. It's not something that I honestly ever thought I'd be interested in per se, but I'm finding that there's so much more in terms of the cinematography that's missing from colored films that you know the director's thinking about, what if I put the lighting here instead of here, and how is the shadows going to how am I going to use the shadows and the lack of lighting in the film and in the character's face and this and that kind of thing. And it, like I said, it kind of takes on a character all of its own, especially when it's in the hands of a really good director. And that's something that I really, really appreciate about this film. And not only that, but the aspects of the legacy of a film like this and the way that it uses black and white. So in this film, and I'm kind of talking effects and filming slightly, but a lot of this film, they would spray down roads to make them look wet and glistening so that there would be reflections of some of the light coming up while they were filming. And that's something that you'll see Michael Mann use a lot in his films. So like I was actually thinking of the film Thief while I was watching this film, because you know that always raining and that kind of mood and that style that Michael Mann uses so often really is a callback to these kind of films.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I really appreciated. Like seeing the connections and starting to see these connections on this podcast is really exciting for me. And I was really drawn into that aspect. The other aspect of this film that I was really drawn into is, we've started watching a couple Hitchcock films in the last couple years, and this is really
Hmm.
my intro into Hitchcock. And what I'll say is I've watched a lot of Hitchcockian influences from the 90s onwards. I just recently watched A Knock at the Cabin, which is an M. Night Shyamalan film, and a lot of his films have kind of Hitchcockian twist to them at the end kind of thing. And so, we went, like, I've been watching a lot of Hitchcockian modern films, and then we've watched a few Hitchcockian or like actual Alfred Hitchcock films. And this is almost like the precursor to Hitchcock's films, in my opinion. Like a lot of aspects of the twists and turns of this kind of story and kind of that twist, unexpected ending is really something that he really embraced, right?
I think one of the hallmarks of getting, if I may be so bold, getting more sophisticated in the type of content you consume is that the further back you go, you realize that all your heroes were essentially stealing something from someone.
Yeah, everything is derivative, essentially.
Right.
And this is derivative of something that was made in like the 20s, and that was derivative of something that was, a theater production in the mid 1800s, and this goes back and back and back, and so humanity is telling the same stories that we've been telling for the last 2,000 years or 4,000 years, right? It's just with these modern aspects, updating it and telling it in different formats, right? And that's something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, even this movie in particular, like it's playing with a lot of, big themes. Like one of the things I found so interesting about this movie is the whole like stranger in a strange land kind of thing,
Right.
So Holly is American and only speaks English, and he's surrounded by people in this movie who don't really speak English. And the film does not give you subtitles. Like,
right.
When somebody's yelling at him and he has no idea what they're saying, you have no idea what they're saying either.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of getting back to who this movie is for, I think at first glance, it might have a limited audience in 2023, but I think the history buffs, the historians are really going to love this. I think film buffs going back and seeing like the connections that I was kind of connecting to with this, like there's a nostalgia here for something I've never seen. And I'm calling back to all these films and all of these thoughts and feelings that I've had watching other films. And that's something that I really appreciated watching this one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's who I think this is kind of for. There's also some iconic scenes. There's a very iconic score. The Third Man score is one of the most iconic scores of film of all time. I'd heard this before, actually, and
really?
I didn't realize that this score is where this was from. And so that was very interesting to me because of how prevalent it is throughout, right?
Yeah, more on the score later, because it is extremely unique.
Yes, very much agree. And then there's, like I said, there's almost like this feeling of deep wrongness and everything is just somewhat off throughout the film, and that's something that I really appreciate as well, because that makes me think of like a great atmospheric horror film, and that's something that I absolutely love. Like I almost thought of It Follows while I was watching this, because
oh really,
that's one of my favorite horror movies, and throughout that movie there's all this just wrongness, like everything is just slightly off to mess with your brain.
You just feel kind of creeped out the whole time.
Yeah, and this film had that just a little bit, but it was there for me the whole time. And that was something that kind of kept me intrigued throughout the film.
Well, and I think the opening narration does a good job of establishing that in like the course of a minute.
Yeah.
The opening lines of this movie is the narrator going, "I never knew the old Vienna before the war. With its Strauss music, its glamour, and its easy charm. Constantinople suited me better. I really got to know it in the classic period of the black market." And so instantly we have this image of like a great, proud city with all this culture and heritage that's just been destroyed, like bombed to hell. And now, like, it's basically just, it's a den of thieves, essentially.
Exactly.
Like, people are doing whatever they can to survive.
Yep. And that's very much apparent as we get later and later into this film.
One thing early in the movie that I found really unsettling is Holly arrives, he goes to the hotel, and he meets the porter who tells him about Harry getting hit by a car. And the porter doesn't really speak English. And he kind of just says, like, oh, Mr. Lime, I hope he's in... He points up and he says, he should be in hell. And then he points down and he says, not in heaven.
Right.
So, like, it's clearly the porter just not understanding what he's saying. But, like, even that in the first 10 minutes, you're just kind of like, ugh. Like,
yeah, for sure. I caught that as well. And again, those little, like, nuggets of wrongness throughout. Who else did you have in mind while you were watching this?
like for people who might enjoy it?
Yeah, like from modern audience perspective.
See, I don't want to say if you're my normal answer, which is just if you're interested in movies, you'll like this movie.
Right.
But at the same time, I do kind of think that if I just threw this movie on in front of a random person, I don't think they'd like it. Not
No.
because it's in black and white, but it is just a little dated through no fault of its own. Even the acting, like all the actors are great, but even the acting is a little cheesy at times, which I think is just kind of a hallmark of the time. So
Yeah, it's certainly hammed up.
a little, yeah. Or I remember there's one scene where this one character gives a great big speech and then he goes, goodbye, Holly. And there's no pause or no breath or anything. And then he's suddenly off frame and you're like, whoa, what? Like, I'm really trying hard not to give my usual answer, but I think I have to give my usual answer.
Yeah, and that's going to be the reality of a film from 1949. Like, this isn't something, that came out in your parents' generation that, that your parents you grew up in the same sphere of, right? Like, it was something that your parents referenced or something like that. Like, this is something that maybe your great-grandparents would reference.
Maybe your
Like,
grandparents, but
yeah, even like your grandparents would have to be somewhat older as well, right? Like, my grandparents were born, only a few years before this movie came out. So
yeah, this wasn't on their radar. And
No.
I mean, yeah. And like this movie has one very big iconic moment that I think has been referenced in more modern classics.
Absolutely.
But for the most part, this isn't the kind of like, it's not one of those big quotable, like Psycho, for instance. That's
Right.
an old movie that's everyone knows because it's just been parodied so much.
Exactly.
This movie, I don't think it's quite achieved like the same cultural status that like other big movies from this era would have.
I would say yes and no. I think the references to this are a little bit more in the cinematography and the style than in the dialogue and the plot.
Yeah, potentially.
The other thing I'll say is I would recommend watching this film with subtitles if they're available to you. Honestly, I don't watch films with subtitles very often, but
I know.
I think
it's the biggest contention in our relationship.
But I think that, in my opinion, in this one, because this is the time period in which it is, and they're kind of using that old-timey American film accent, even like the American accents can be sometimes somewhat harder to understand.
People also just talk really, like the dialogue is very quick and snappy. So
Yes.
I did catch myself rewinding a lot, just being like, whoa, what did he say? Like, what's going on? So
when to watch this film? I think this is kind of a late night one, and I don't think this is a during the week kind of watch, because I think if you're asleep and not really paying enough attention to this film, then a lot's going to pass you by, and you're not going to appreciate all the little details in this.
no, this is a leave your phone in the other room kind of movie. Like, don't get distracted.
Yeah, I very much agree. Where to watch? It's not really streaming anywhere right now.
No.
You can rent it, I believe, on Prime.
That's what I did, yeah.
Yeah, and so limited visibility. There's some contention online as to whether or not this film is actually in Creative Commons or not yet. So, this film could be something that might be much more accessible in the near future because of its age, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I guess a lot of those old movies are going to be entering the public domain pretty soon.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, unless Disney can find a way to destroy that. I don't know if that's something they're working on, but it seems like something they'd be working on.
Yeah. And I think that's it for the primer episode for The Third Man. I think, like I said, I'm really intrigued to hear your full opinion of this because, again, I thought you'd be really high on this one. Oh, and that's what I'll say as well about who this movie is for before we kind of wrap up the primer episode is I thought that because of this film having its roots in a novella, there's so much English, what's the word I'm looking for? There's so much imagery or like analogies or symbolism.
Like slang?
No, not slang.
Vernacular?
It's a very it's a very deep film. Like there's a lot bubbling underneath the surface of what this film is truly about, and you know, one thing is kind of representing another thing, and there's just so much poeticism to the film and the time period in which it's taking place that I thought that, you know, somebody who's really interested in reading and really likes reading kind of these meteor type of novels would really appreciate a film like this.
Yeah, I can see what you mean.
I'm kind of butchering my description, so I hope you do, but
that's okay. I've been there myself.
Yeah. And that's that for the primer episode. So I think we will talk to you next week and do the deep dive into The Third Man and talk spoilers. Nothing but spoilers. All right. Well, see you next time. Oh, and I should mention, don't forget the draft episode is coming up in the next month, I believe. Maybe a month and a half from now.
Are you talking to our viewers or are you talking to me?
Kind of both. Have you thought about what you're doing yet? Have you come up with
Have
you come up with what you're doing?
I've come up with what I'm doing, but I won't say it just yet.
Cool. I believe I've also come up with what I'm doing at this point. I'm probably slightly behind in my viewing, though.
I am more than slightly behind. But...
Having the 6 seasons in a movie category, you're definitely behind if you're not 6 seasons in at this point.
Well, I'm in a very Holly Martin stage in my life right now where I'm just constantly bubbling and like I'm constantly like stumbling through like scenes, if you know what I mean.
You're just always drunk, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I'm a writer too, so yeah.
So you're really connected with Holly.
Oh yeah, loved him.
Okay. Well, we'll see you next time for the deep dive episode.
Bye.
VCR out!
Don't ever say that again.